Good evening, everybody, or wherever you're watching this, because I know that people could be watching from anywhere. And it's Friday night, and my name is Mike Simpson, and we are broadcasting from the unceded territory of the Squamish people here on the Sunshine Coast. I live in Gibsons, and I'm the Green Party candidate in the upcoming or the expected to be happening election. Should it happen in the near future, or should it happen in the next couple of years? We don't know, but we're getting prepped for it. And one of the things that we wanted to do on a regular basis was touch base with our core Green people. And then we thought, well, we'll broadcast it to anybody who wants to hear what we're talking about and what our questions are all about. And so we are also on Facebook and Instagram right now. And hello, anybody who is watching, or if you're watching the recording later. I hope you enjoy it. What we are doing every week is just having a little bit of a dialogue. And the idea is you can bring any question you want to me whatsoever, and I'll try and answer it. And then people can get a bit of a feel for what are my opinions and so on as your Green candidate. And the other thing is we're going to tackle a different subject every week as we go here. And last week, we talked about wildfires. And this week's not too far off because the subject is still on everybody's mind. I think anybody who saw the news today saw that although we won the gold in women's soccer, yay, we also have now had a second community burned down because of the fires, and the fires are burning. I think there's 300 fires burning in British Columbia today, which is really scary given that the weather's cooling down and there's a lot more winds blowing, and we don't see any real rain in sight for a long time. So it's trying to spit with rain out here in Gibsons, but it's not looking very good. What is looking good is our campaign. Since you're all here, I'll just give you a real quick update because we had a great event last night on the Sunshine Coast, and it was meant to be a fairly small, tight fundraiser of around 20 people. But believe it or not, Greens have got a lot of energy and a lot of fundraising power because that wasn't even our main fundraiser. Our main fundraisers are coming up, and that fundraiser phenomenally raised $16,000 in one 2-hour period. So yay, Greens, go. We are going to powerhouse, and we are already showing that there's a lot of enthusiasm. And that's very encouraging for me as your candidate because you can't go down this road alone. And so what I'd love to do tonight is chat with you. And particularly, I want to actually get more of an interaction going. Last week, I was trying to kind of give you my thoughts on fires. This week, I'm also wanting to just chat about the nature of a climate emergency. And in some ways, that would be more fun if I could actually interact with you a little bit with your questions. So I hope you have some. And maybe what I thought I would start out with is just I'm going to talk for a little while about the concept of a climate emergency, and then we can more interestingly, I want to talk about the psychology of a climate emergency, because the word emergency in Canada, we have the Emergency Act, which is, or the war measure. If there's a war breaks out, or or something happens like that, then the government can institute a piece of legislation very quickly, like with COVID. It's an emergency, and so they can institute powers that they would not normally use. And when we're talking climate emergency, that's the spirit of what people were trying to get going in the climate emergency movement. There's about 38 countries that have signed on and said that they are in a climate emergency. And the United Nations has asked all countries to consider declaring a climate emergency. And you'll probably remember that Canada declared a climate emergency. I think it was in 2019, and it was passed in Parliament. If I recall, there's around 60 people, 60 votes, mostly conservative, that were opposed. But surprising number of political parties did agree that it was a climate emergency. And you'll also recall that there was actually no binding measures associated with that piece of legislation. So we call it a climate emergency, and then you just don't have to do anything. And that was the nature of our response in Canada to a climate emergency. And that's very different than some of the cities and some of the municipalities and some of the places that have taken it a lot more seriously. I remember I was asked to present to the City Council of Vancouver on the climate emergency. And so I did make a presentation. If you look at what the city passed and its attempts to try and actually take action, it's quite concrete. And it's very different than what the Liberals did, which was declare a climate emergency and the very next day subsidize the fossil fuel industry to the tune of over $10 billion, I think it was. And of course, they bought the $4.5 billion pipeline. So you say climate emergency, and the very next day, you actually directly invest in fossil fuels. And that is obviously not an emergency, or it's not my version of an emergency. So what I wanted to do right now is just, I would love it if somebody would want to volunteer just to talk to me here for a second. Is there anybody out there that would want to throw their hand up and say, yeah, Mike, I'll talk to you, and you don't mind kind of broadcasting on Facebook and me asking you a few questions about the nature of emergency in your mind? Is there anybody who wants to take a shot at that and be brave? Or shall I? Don't be shy. I need somebody just to say, okay, I'll do it. So what you do is you just throw up your hand and wave at me. Okay, if you want, try it, and I'll unmute you. Nobody wants to. Oh, there we go. Let me see. So that's John. I'm just going to unmute you. John, can you hear me? Can you talk? Say something.
Yeah, I can
Perfect.
hear you.
Good. Perfect. So I'm going to actually add you to the spotlight and see if, there we go. Now, hopefully people can see you. Yeah, there you are. How are you?
Well, I'm hanging in there, trying to ascertain what the hell an emergency means, just like you.
Yeah. So you know what I thought would be more fun is, like, because we can go and look for the technical qualifications for. You want me to read you the technical qualification? I'll tell you technically what it is. I looked it up. It's actually quite interesting. It says a state in which normal procedures are suspended and extraordinary measures are taken in order to avert a disaster.
So yeah, that certainly includes buying a pipeline the next day.
So you know what I did is I quickly looked up, well, what's a disaster then, right? And here's what a disaster is defined as. A disaster is an occurrence disrupting the normal conditions of existence and causing a level of suffering that exceeds the capacity of adjustment of the affected community. And it made me think, I'll bet you, realistically, what we're facing right now with communities burning down and our inability to fight the forest fires and deal with temperatures is actually more of a disaster than it is an emergency. But the emergency is the definition to prevent the disaster, right? Yeah. And that's John, the technical definition. What I wanted to chat with you about is ask you is, have you ever personally been in anything that resembled an emergency?
Well, I was on a plane that had to make an emergency landing at Myrtle Beach, South Carolina Air Force Base.
Perfect. So, I'm sure that everybody, in fact, anybody that's on this call or is listening on Facebook or tuning into our broadcast can try this. And that is just to go back, because most of us have experienced something, come across a car accident or something that you would go, that feels like an emergency, And I think what I want to tune into is, what is the actual feeling inside? Forget the technical conceptual stuff in your head, but what is the feeling that you have during an emergency?
Well, it was, I was pretty certain I was going to die. I was basically frozen in fear. I was in my seat, and there was smoke pouring out of the cockpit, and the plane, we were in this is a long time ago. I'm old. This was my first plane ride. I was going from New York City to Miami, and we were traveling through a severe weather situation where it was streaks of lightning outside, and we were going down at an angle like this, and people on the plane were screaming. I wasn't screaming because I didn't have a voice.
Right.
So
true, an absolute 100% emergency. There's no question. Yeah, it's an emergency.
It certainly felt like it. I mean, the pilot landed and he got a standing ovation when he came out, and we had to single file, because at that time we weren't allowed, we had to go straight from the plane to the cafeteria at the Air Force Base. We couldn't go anywhere else. And yeah, it was harrowing.
So you knew it was an emergency, you felt it was an emergency, and you can claim, yeah, that was definitely an emergency. What I'd love to know then is, what about the moment just before you decided it was an emergency? What was that like? What were the inklings that come along that you feel like, emotionally, I don't feel like it's an emergency yet, but it's starting to feel like one?
I think it was when the smoke first started coming from the cockpit. It was, it wasn't all full blown, but there was a point in time, and I still don't know what it was, but there was a point in time shortly thereafter where there was pounding on the door of the cockpit from the inside of the cockpit. And that, yeah, that's pretty sure. The pilot came out and said, we're going to make an emergency landing. And,
Right.
Right.
So this is such a great live example. I'm sure other people can feel into this moment of how an emergency emotionally starts to develop. You are flying along, and yes, life is scary, whatever, but you're not expecting it to be an emergency. Then somehow you get the clues and the inklings that this might be an emergency. And then somewhere you decide at some point something significant enough has happened. And in your case, the leader of the plane is pounding on the door saying this is definitely an emergency, right? And then you feel it, the full scale of what an emergency is, and then you have to live in fear and so on. That's what I heard from you. Is that about correct, that trajectory?
Yeah, pretty much.
And then the relief later, the relief that this is not an emergency, we landed and we're safe.
Well, it got worse because they fixed the plane. We had to get back on it and fly.
Oh, no, they didn't. There's no way. Did they put you right back on the same plane?
Yeah.
Oh, you're kidding. Oh, God. That is crazy. Well, actually, there's some analogies there. So you can see where I'm going here. I mean, I don't, if anybody else wants to describe an emergency, don't even hesitate, throw up your hand. But what I want to get at is that when we talk about establishing a climate emergency, and when we talk about this politically, where is the Canadian public and where is the Canadian leadership? Because let's think of the government as being the folks in the pilot. They're supposed to be running the country or running the plane. And then you have all of us along for the ride. And at some point, the confidence to tell everybody this is an emergency. Now, theoretically, that happened in June of 2019. The government stood up unanimously and said, we have a climate emergency on our hands. And they said, this is an emergency. And then the very next day, they continue with not just business as usual, but they actually proactively go the wrong direction. So there must be some kind of a disconnect around what political leaders are thinking and what we actually think is an emergency, a climate emergency. So I'm just curious, in your mind, when you were on that plane, what are some of the ways in which we can actually, like, what are the ways in which we suddenly decide? I'm trying to get into that feeling of this is an emergency. How? Because we're seeing some young people see that in the climate.
The deal with climate change is and even the disasters that are happening is that it's the difference between boiling a frog from cold water to throwing a frog into boiling water.
Right.
In the plane, I was thrown into the boiling water.
Right.
It was maybe a minute between when I first started seeing the smoke, and I was sitting right up next to the bulkhead there.
Yeah.
And from the moment I first started seeing the smoke till the smoke was coming out badly and the door was pounding was maybe a minute. So that was sudden.
Yeah.
The disasters, we're all here, we're all still breathing. For the most part, life is going on as usual. It's very hard to get that same sense of emergency.
Right. Right. Even if there's fires. So even if there's fires in British Columbia, 300 fires burning right now. I don't know how many communities are evacuated. Chase is evacuating tonight. Another town is burnt down. It's still not, like, one of our issues is it's not in our riding. Like, the apparent the apparentness of the smoke right in your face, breathing it. Well, it did happen the other night, but it's still not how much. What I'm getting at here is, what do you think in our riding would make people go, this is actually an emergency? Like, when would it happen? When would it happen?
I don't, I don't know. You have to have the feeling of imminent death, I think, before you really buy into emergency. And of course, with climate change, by that time it's too late.
Right.
Way too late.
Right. And this actually brings us to one of the critical issues, that many of the things that we in the Green Party are talking about are actually things that we're spotting first. It's like we're at the front of the plane, or maybe we're just paying more attention. But for some reason on the plane, some people will realize it's an emergency before other people do. Right. And that's something that the Green Party has been saying. It's the Green Party and the Greens and the environmental movement that have had their fingers on the alarm bell for 20 years, saying it's coming, it's coming. And now that we're feeling it and it's here, everybody is waking up and going, oh, the liberals wake up and the NDP wakes up. And the conservatives, even in our riding, are walking around with brochures about climate. It means they're waking up. But the problem is that did they wake up soon enough? And you're hitting it on the button, right? Is that they're not. And so then the question becomes, as Greens, well, how do we not only say that it's a climate emergency, like I think most Canadians now, if we look at the polling, I saw some polling today that's putting the climate and the climate concerns at the top of Canadians' minds. It's all now, the issue though is that they're not necessarily, like, one of the things that happens here is that somebody on that plane probably started to technically do something. This is the other thing I wanted to ask you about. When you were in that emergency, and anybody else on the phone here can go think back to an emergency that you were in. And you don't have to think about other people. You can just test yourself on this and go, what was your emotive reaction? Because we are sentient beings in the sense that we react in a certain way. They say that flight, fright, food, there's sort of 5 F's. It's like, or do you freeze? And some people must have frozen on that plane. Others might have jumped into action. Others might have wanted to get off the plane and flee. Do you remember your own reaction into that? And what happened with you?
The only thing I remember is literally just gripping my armrests and just holding on. And I don't even, I don't remember the sensation of breathing. I may have been holding my breath the entire time, for all I know.
Right.
It was just, I was preparing for death.
Yeah.
I was 10 years old.
Yeah, that's young. Yeah. See, this is an interesting one, because like, if we think about this and we use the same analogy, we look around at our neighbors and everybody and we go, okay, and we're all excited in the Green Party. We have been for decades, saying, look, it's a terribly consequential thing that we're getting ourselves into if we hit 3.5 degrees. I mean, we're headed straight for 3.5 degrees right now. We're at 1.1 and houses are burning down, communities are burning down, and we have 300 fires, and there's fires all over the planet right now, flooding all over the planet. I mean, you don't have to be Al Gore to understand that this is going on at 1.1. So what will 2 look like? And we can see the plane's going to crash. So then the question becomes, well, how do people react and how do politicians react? And I think a lot of us react exactly the same way we would in a situation where, like when you're on the plane, some people are going to freeze. Some people are going to jump up and be active. And some people are going to just want to flee and get out of the room. I'm sure that some people on that plane might have just been holding their heads and trying to just not even look at what's going on.
Yeah.
And that's our challenge, is that we have to not be mad at those people, but realize that these are different ways to react to a sense of emergency. And I think what we have going on, if we look at the parties right now, is we have complete denial going on with the Conservatives, just saying this just doesn't exist, right? It's not an emergency. That's why they voted against it. You can go through the list in the parliament there and see that they voted against. Nay, 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 nay. They're just saying it doesn't exist. And then we've got also the Liberals, who are actually literally deceiving people by saying it's a climate emergency and then buying a pipeline. I mean, that's deception. It's complete deception. Then you have the NDP, who are just thinking this is some kind of game, that you can actually stand up and talk about climate change. But when you're put on the hot spot in Parliament and you ask Jagmeet Singh, you say, are you or are you not against fracking? He won't answer the question. It means he's not, it's like standing on the plane, the burning plane you are, and going, is this plane or is this plane not burning? And Jagmeet Singh is saying, oh, well, let's talk about jobs right now. No. The question was, is the plane burning or not? Do we have to keep the fracking in the ground? And you won't answer the question. And so we as Greens have got a real task ahead of us, because we have people responding to the idea emotionally of emergency in some completely different ways. Listen, John, you've been great. I see that David wants to join. I'm going to let you off the hook for a second, see if I can pull him on. And anybody else wants to join in this conversation. This is kind of what I wanted to do tonight, was just converse about this, because we don't know the answer to this problem. As Greens, how do we deal with the idea that people have fundamentally different emotional and intellectual reactions to the idea of an emergency? Let me see if I can.
So get rid of me and bring on.
How do I pull you up here? I go, just wait a second here. I'll be able to do it. I go replay spotlight. There you are. Can you hear me, David?
Yes. Yes.
Great. I can hear you. Have you been in an emergency? Is this resonating for you? This talk we're having around what is it emotionally, not intellectually, to think of this concept of emergency?
I first ran, well, to me, that feeling is hopeless. And I ran into it with the peace movement. And I just had to admit, there are so many nuclear weapons that if any decision is ever made to push the button, we're toast. It's done. Right. And I could not find a way to deal with it until I said to the group I was in, I have no hope whatsoever of getting through that. If that button gets pushed, I'm hopeless.
Yeah.
And so I can't walk around saying I got hope. I'm hoping we can get through this any longer. Right. And I forget the fellow's name that came. He University of Arizona, and he came to the coast, and we filled a good sized room, and the responses were so typical. The first responses after he gave this talk was a couple of older fellow just saying, you're just cherry picking the data, and you're trying to overwhelm us with the problem. And it took a few minutes, but the audience refused to let them go on and said, no, we don't. There's the rest of us here don't agree with you. Yeah. But there were other feelings, and they were moms with kids that just cannot feel hopeless. And and I get that. Not everybody can actually feel that hopelessness. Yeah. But when you get there, when you actually admit to yourself that you feel hopeless, it allows you to then imagine going on. At least it allowed me to imagine going on. And so I think it's a part of the journey.
Yeah. And so you came, that was something that actually many people in the environmental movement, if we go back and look historically, they're coming out of the peace movement in the 1980s. And if we went back historically and looked at the Brundtland Commission when it first published its report on our common future, and which was to define sustainable development, Brundtland actually, it was a commission, it was a report on development, environment, and peace. Peace was in there, and peace gets dropped between 1987 and the Brundtland report and 1992 and Rio. And in Rio, it just becomes environment and development. And of course, the big thing was that the Cold War was in 1989. And so everybody thought, well, that's over and it's gone. But if you look at the roots of where people were starting to change their attitudes about our role as human beings on the planet, realizing we could blow the whole thing up. I mean, I can't remember how many nuclear weapons we had. I think I'm just trying to
50,000.
Yeah, it was tens of thousands. And the interesting thing today is we have fewer, but they're far more powerful, right?
Yes.
Yeah. But the same predicament existed, which was that we had back then this concept called 2 minutes to midnight. Do you remember that? Where the atomic clock and the scientists were saying, look, there's time ticking. If we continue on this trajectory, we may actually kill each other and blow the whole planet up and have a nuclear winter and so on. That same concept that, you know, we are actually capable of wiping out the biosphere has now translated into the environmental movement. Ironically, is that the nuclear movement and nuclear weapons still exist. And my understanding right now is that we've been as close in the last year and a half to 2 minutes to midnight as we were during the Cold War period. But there's just a lot less understanding of this. Yeah. So that's actually interesting you're saying that, because what we're talking about tonight, for if you just joined or if you're watching on Facebook or whatever, is we're trying to understand what is a climate emergency. And we're not trying to just necessarily technically understand it. We're trying to emotionally understand it in order to figure out, well, why do politicians not take this more seriously? And why are we in the Green Party taking this so seriously? Because we're taking it awfully seriously. We're campaigning on let me give you an example. When we stand up in front of Canadians and we say that we want to cut our emissions by 2030 by 60%, that's way more than the Liberals have been saying they wanted to get. Here, maybe I should just back up a bit here, because you see, the whole point is that if we were to save ourselves on the planet, we do know the numbers that are necessary. We need to be able to reduce our emissions by at least 60%. That's the science of it, by 2030. And we need to get to absolutely net zero by 2050 and start to reverse trends by planting trees and so on, right? So the government had said 30% below 2005 levels by 2030. And then recently they announced that they would be more ambitious and they would up that. Now, Canada is actually the laggard of all of the G7 countries. We are doing the least. And this is called a nationally determined NDC, nationally determined target, or nationally determined contributions, actually. And what it means is that we would actually reduce our emissions by 40 to 45%. That's not even close to what we have to do. And so when we in the Green Party stand up and go 60% is serious, we end up sounding a little bit like very similar to the nuclear folks who said we've got to get rid of nuclear weapons, because if we push the buttons, the world's going to end. And that becomes a hard sell, because what you're really doing is you're tuning in emotionally to the nature of what an emergency is. And you have to somehow wake others up and go, it's an emergency. Can't you see this? Right?
Yes.
So I'd love to know in your minds, if I actually have done a TED talk on this talk of hope and hopelessness. If you ever want to see it, it's kind of interesting, because I think that there is a connection with what you're talking about waking up, which is to actually dive into what does it truly feel to just be hopeless for a second. And if you can, instead of avoiding the feeling, you can actually understand, I've got to do something, right? I've got to do something about this. Yeah, listen, I'll let you just sit on hope. We may come back to hope and hopelessness, but I don't want to go too deep into the hopeless part first, before I just explore this idea of what is an emergency really like? What does it feel like? And I think I see that Robin, you want to join us. Do you want to, let me just see if I can spotlight you. Add, replace spotlight. Sorry, I'm a bit slow here on this, but there we go.
Cool.
There you are.
All right.
How you doing?
Cool. I'm good. Yeah, you too. But something that you said earlier made me think that I have only recently woken up to the fact that this is urgent. Right. I've been working for the Green Party. I've been knowing this is important, but recently the urgency has hit me. I think that the more we can get, the more people seeing that it is an urgent current emergency, the more you'll see you'll get enough people reacting with action.
Yeah, now before you go, can I ask you about that? Yeah. Waking up to the urgency, because we've had the information. There's lots of information. If I go on the internet right now and I punch in climate change, you can get all the information in the world, right? You get all the carbon and this and that. And yes, the fires are caused by, every CBC article mentions, yes, it's all climate change. But that waking up to it, what caused it for you? How come you felt that something, this is urgent?
That's a great question. I'm not sure. I guess it just all came together and it's like, holy shit, this is now. Sorry for swearing on Zoom.
No, that's cool.
But it's, I mean, we're busy with our lives. We go through them. my life wasn't affected. Yeah, the increasing smoke every year has definitely brought it home, brought it closer.
Yeah.
But no, there's just something this year where it's just like, no, we can't wait. We've got to make big decisions right now. And that urgency has just put more fire in me to do as much as I can until everything falls apart. And then at least I know I've done everything I could.
Yeah.
So I think the more people we could wake up, the more people we would get doing everything they could. And then maybe it wouldn't fall apart.
So you can't remember the very specific moment? No.
Not really, no.
And
it's been coming over time. I've been aware of it, its importance. It's just been growing and growing.
Is it other people around you, or was it information that changed your mind, or was it, what was, I'm trying to.
Probably a combination. I'm not sure.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I think it's probably going to be different for everybody anyway. I mean, it would be interesting for people to reflect on that who are watching this call. If you've ever been in an emergency, or if you're feeling the climate emergency now, you didn't always feel it was an emergency, because there's normal life before an emergency, right? And then the question is, well, what's triggering it? Because if
it's kind of like maybe what John said about the frog boiling.
Yeah.
You know what? I was in a pot of cold water. I knew it was going to boil one day, but I didn't think it was going to happen soon. I didn't think my daughter's life would be really in much jeopardy. Now, I guess I think my daughter's not going to live the way I expected her to, and we've got to change things fast and change them now.
Yeah, because the progression. How old's your daughter again? I can't remember. She's only
5.
5.
Yeah.
Yeah. So if you go 80 years in the future, she's definitely in a 3.5 degree scenario. In
For
fact,
sure.
Yeah. And so what does that mean? Yeah.
Right.
That's the existential problem we have. So once we get into an emergency, like here, let me just ask you, once you're in an emergency and you can feel that, and it's limbic, like in the sense that it's an emotional feeling, it's a bit of panic. I don't want to call it panic, but it's an emergency feeling. I don't even know, what is that?
It's not panic. It's not panic. It's like, it's I have to do everything I can.
Yeah.
I can't do less than I can anymore. Before I could just do, I'm going to do this for most of the day and this for part of the day. And now it's like, no, I've got to really take this seriously.
Okay. So let's say, here's my question is, how do we sustain that feeling? Because one of the things that I've noticed in looking at emergencies and trying to think about this a little bit is, how do you sustain the feeling I've got to do something over time, because we're in this for the long haul? This is one of our big existential problems with climate change, is that we can't get the plane to land. Like in John's scenario, he gets to land the plane, sigh a big, relief, but we're not in that scenario. We have to actually stay in this, and it's going to be for decades. So what, in your mind, when you think about that, what is your, let me just say, what's your observation of that feeling? Could you sustain this over time, this sense of urgency? Because we're asking people to do that.
I think so. I think we all can. Like, look at COVID. How many of us could really sustain the isolation for as long as we thought was necessary? And how many people had parties even before they were allowed? There were enough of us that actually sustained it, that I think that we can sustain a state of emergency for as long as it takes.
Yeah.
And some people won't, and that's fine. That not everyone can do this, but those of us who can should.
Well, you brought up another thing that I wanted to talk about, so I'm glad you've done it, because it's a perfect segue into the idea that we have all actually experienced a 1.5 years of COVID and a state of emergency. We've technically been in one, and we're now technically in a state of emergency because of the fires here in BC. And then there's sort of the COVID fatigue and emergency over time. And then it's the different behaviors that we observe. Like, it's remarkable how some people are getting through COVID and still denying it. Like, they'll get all the way to the hospital bed and still deny it, right? That COVID is real. And it reminds me so much of the same thing we're having in climate change. Is climate change real? I can't believe there's still a few people talking about that, right? And it's so hot. So one of the conundrums is, as Green Party people, we seem to be speaking the truth, but should we even bother with that small percentage? What do we do about that? What do we do?
No, I think we don't try to convince everyone. We just try to do what we can.
Yeah.
And gather as many people as are actually gatherable, so that we're fighting with more people, a bigger army. But no, I think we have to let people be people.
Yeah, this is the thing. Okay, so I can just say, as a candidate, like, because we have to somehow present the emergency nature of this, but it's kind of bad news because it's long term. It's not something that we can say, oh, if you just did this, we can solve this problem and you can go back to normal. You know, like the COVID talk of going back to normal.
It's not bad news if there's a roadmap for hope, if there's a new way of being on the other side that's healthier, that's sustainable, that everyone will be happy. Not everyone, but it's a good way of life on the other side. It's just different.
Boom. Actually, you just see that where you go. That's exactly how I wanted to end tonight. In some ways, we're not going to end. We can go to questions, but what I wanted to get at with this climate emergency and the disaster side of it is that there's a sequencing here in our messaging. And at first, you need to tell people that the plane is broken and it's burning, and you got to get people to act. Right. And then the most important part now is that we have to be able to say, okay, but the way to make this plane continue to fly is to improve the plane, or to improve the way in which we live on the planet, and that there are these viable solutions to do that. And that is where we get into this concept of resilience, which we Greens have been talking about, which is that the future is not to go back, to pre-COVID or pre-climate emergency. We can't go back. The way is to go forward into a future which will be significantly more resilient. Right. And there's two other things I wanted to just chat, if I can hold you on the line a second here. And that's that in climate change, we have these two things we always talk about. One is mitigation, and the other one is adaptation. And the mitigation is what we've concentrated on because we're trying to stop the plane from burning. Mitigation is about preventing climate change. How do we mitigate it? How do we lower emissions? So on and so on. But we're now on a burning plane. I mean, there's no question the plane's burning, right? So the question then becomes, how do we adapt? And it's through the adaptation lens that we can see thousands of possibilities. Like, there's so many ways in which I think that when we look at our green platform, we can see that when we talk climate emergency, we can also see it as an opportunity to bring in lots of money like they did with COVID, pump tons of money into a green economy, start building all those wind turbines, start building that infrastructure, start building the breakaways that we need for fire breaks, start doing all the things that people have good ideas on how to build a more resilient planet in the future. And that's our big opportunity, right? So because I think what our problem is that if we stay in climate emergency mode, we will wear people out, because it's very hard to stay in it for years. You can't stay in that psychology of an emergency
our hair goes gray. It's not healthy. We know from COVID too. We do suffer.
No, and it is way more fun, even if we're going down on a burning plane, to at least go down, right? Saying, okay.
For sure.
Yeah.
And we have to do all those things to keep ourselves sane and healthy and happy. So we do have to have some of the creature comforts that keep us feeling good.
Yeah. And that's where having, if you can have 10 solar panels on the roof and, and your radio still functions. And, there are ways in which we can transition to a better life. And I know there's going to be lots of green people or hardcore Greens who go, we just can't do that. I think we have to look at it as we're flying a plane in a totally unsustainable way. And the future is much more sustainable. And there's a transition. And the nature of an emergency is that we have to speed up the pace. That's the thing, is it's telling you don't have all day to make this transition. We have actually only until 2030. The stats on this are really clear. This is another thing I can bring up around the climate emergency, is that there's confusion when you talk to people about this technically. And that is, some people will say, we got 12 years. But what they don't understand is that it's based on 3 different scenarios. When we give these climate emergency scenarios and we say, when will we run out of the carbon budget? There's 3 scenarios. One is absolute certainty. And this was established in 2011, where the IPCC, the International Panel on Climate Change, said, look, if we want to know what's going to happen in the future, we know there's a certain amount of carbon we can pump into the air. That's our carbon budget. And then we can tell you with a certain degree of certainty of what would happen at 1.5. That's what we're trying to stay, 1.5 stay alive. So here's the part. Is they basically have realized that if you wanted 100% certainty that we're going to be able to land the plane, and we're going to be okay, that date's already gone by. It went by a while ago. So the second scenario is like 65% certainty or something like that. And then there's 50% certainty. When you get into those scenarios, that's how you get your extra 12 years. Do you see what I'm getting at? So we've got an extra 12 years, but it's not 100% certainty anymore. Right now, it's like something like 50 or 60% certainty that maybe we'll stay under 1.5. So the odds are getting, like, the planes we're in John's plane, we're getting into more and more of a rocky ride here, right? And there's more and more smoke coming out, and the pilot's saying, okay, we got 50% chances of in the next 120 minutes of landing the plane, right? Whereas if we caught it a little bit earlier, we'd have had 100% chances of landing the plane. And that puts us in an odd position, because the psychology of telling people about the emergency is getting harder and harder to give them that hopeful answer that David, you were clinging to, that idea of hope, right? I'm just going to check around. When I'm watching and spot you, I can't see everybody, but I'm going to also invite at this point anybody to ask any question you like. And it doesn't have to be about the climate emergency anymore. It can be about our campaign. It can be about anything you like. It can be about any questions that you want for me as a candidate, or we can just rest in having had a really interesting conversation on the climate emergency. What we wanted to do is shorten these broadcasts. We went a long time last week and we realized it's pretty long. So this week I'm going to try and shorten it, interact with you a little bit more. And if you have any specific questions, or if anybody wants to go back to commenting on what this psychology of an emergency is about, because we're facing it. I should say that there's the climate emergency, but if you look at the Sustainable Development Goals and what the United Nations has told us we must tackle by the year 2030, you'll quickly see that we also face other emergencies of a similar nature: the biodiversity emergency, species loss emergency, potable water emergency. We seem to be in a crunching period here. That if you went back to the 1970s and 80s and you looked at the reports that they put out called the limits to growth and so on, if you looked at all those reports, you would see that they pointed towards a 2020 period, which we are in right now. And we are actually seeing many of those things crunch right as we speak. So we get to live the reality that was predicted 20 or 30 years ago. And that reality, unfortunately, is an emergency. So we do well to talk about this. Stephanie, are you trying to jump on? I see are you trying to jump on and say, anybody wants to jump on, you just got to you can raise your hand if you're in Zoom. That allows me to see you. Or you can just wave around like that and I'll try to spotlight you. I see David coming on, so I will go Stephanie and then David. I'll just go spotlight. There you go, Stephanie. Emergency or not?
Yes, hopefully my internet can sustain this. But so we talked about this psychology, and I think that that's something that a lot of Greens and environmentalists are often told, that we're doomsayers, right? We're just talking about all the horrible things that are going to happen, and they are kind of happening. And however, you know, how do we get people excited about the emergency if they don't see the fire yet, and they don't see the smoke, and they're just clueless and they don't know what's going on, but without frightening them and scaring them off and them running away screaming with their fingers in their ears? I'm wondering how, you know, if you have any ideas of how to engage people without frightening them, but, you know, getting them involved and as passionate about it as we are.
Sure. Well, one thing that's very interesting is a few years ago, I was asked to do a workshop in the United Kingdom at a climate change conference. And on a side note, there was another group talking about the psychology of climate change and what causes people to take action. And it was really interesting for me to listen in, because they said, you know, it's not the information. People can be informed about climate change and they won't take action. And they said, and it isn't a measure of their motivation, because people can be incredibly motivated. I want to do something about climate change, and they still won't take action. So you can be informed and motivated. And I've always thought if you were informed and motivated, surely that's enough to go and take action, but it actually proves to be not true. What proves to be the critical factor is offering the next step, and it should be small enough or incremental enough that the person can see from the information and the motivation that they have that they would take that step, right? So the easiest step is, okay, you know, you don't say to them, go and set up a community windmill in your community. I mean, that's a huge step. It's a great step, but it's huge. But if we can offer as Greens the incremental steps so that people can actually feel that they're moving forward. You see, you're no longer hiding on the plane like this. You feel like you're moving forward to do anything at all. And that's where, for example, you know, get involved with the Green Party. Just come in and volunteer and do something, right? And then bang, you feel like you're part of the group, and then it builds very quickly. I mean, you've been a long time activist forever, right? And you can probably remember the idea of these incremental steps, and it gets easier to take bigger steps than it is to just leap into a big step straight away, right? I mean, I will ask you, you're very dedicated, Green. You work very hard for us. But what made you originally get involved? Can you remember that first step that you took, the first one?
I think for me, it was really just a matter of knowledge. You know, when I learned, I had like a feeling to maybe be vegetarian when I was younger.
Right.
But it wasn't until I had the presentations about factory farming that I decided for sure I'm going to become vegetarian. So it was that kind of like solid information that made my decisions really easy. Or even as a little kid, I asked, what's the difference between white bread and brown bread? And as soon as it was explained to me, I stopped eating white bread because there's there's very little nutrients in it. So
Okay,
to me, it just seemed very, very
yeah.
obvious,
No,
like
but
and fact-based, like, oh, we should hang our clothes on the drying line and not use the dryer. That makes sense. Check.
Yeah.
Like,
So
yeah,
that actually is hitting exactly the nail on the head, which is that it was within graspable reach of who you were at the time, right? Like you could change your diet. Okay, now if that seems like such a small thing, but at the same time, when we look at Drawdown, the book Drawdown that Catherine Wilkinson has written, she names changing our diets and what we eat as being the most effective singular way that we can affect climate change as individuals, because the change from the meat diet to a plant-based diet has such significant carbon footprint that is the number one thing to do. That's interesting. It's more than transportation, which I would have thought it would be changing your car or something like that. Now in Canada, it's slightly different. Our number one emissions are definitely transportation, and it's actually the oil sector, and then it's transportation. But I would think that because we're the breadbasket of the world and because of our industrial agriculture, that actually the way in which food is farmed or in which cows are farmed actually is significant in Canada as well. But my point being, long rant, but my point being is that you took an incremental step, right? And that's
indeed. And then it evolves too, right? You learn a little bit, okay, vegetarian is like, oh, well, maybe I should be vegan, or you know, maybe I eat local this or that, or, you know, it does evolve as you gain more information.
So I'm just going to say to everybody who's on the call, if you went back to that moment that I was talking to you about, where you first were in an emergency, it could have been, like I said, a car accident, a plane crash, whatever it was, you've been in some kind of an emergency. There is the freeze moment that many people you freeze. You get the information and you freeze. And the key thing in a car accident, you'll know, or in any kind of an emergency, is to tell somebody to do something. The overwhelming situation is overwhelming, but if you say to somebody, go get a blanket, you know, they run and they get a blanket. Or you say, or stop the cars from hitting, from getting, put up a sign and tell people there's been an accident. Then people run and they do it. It's amazing how quickly, given a task, people will quickly do things. And that is our challenge in the Green Party, is we need to be able to come up with those ideas about exactly how we can react as Canadians to adapt and to mitigate against climate change. And that's where, if you go to the Green Party policy called Mission Possible, you see a plethora of good ideas, lots of good ideas of the steps that we can take. Like, I'll give you an example right now, was we're saying, rather than buy F-15s and fighter jets, let's put the money into water bombers. And it's such a practical thing that we can do immediately. In Ottawa right now, the federal government can purchase water bombers for the provinces. It can be done, right? And those are the practical things you'll find in Mission Possible, are all those steps that a government can take, not just individuals. David, I left you way behind. I hope you're still thinking whatever you're thinking, because I'm gonna unspotify you and bring you on here. And anybody else, just put up your hand. Let me just see if I can find spotlight for everyone. There you are. You're on again.
Sorry, Mike, there's Genevieve.
Oh, Genevieve. Okay, I'll leave you, David, or because you've chatted. Let me pull in Genevieve here.
I don't know if it's Genevieve or Genevieve, but she has put a very interesting statement question in chat.
Okay, let me read it out. So it's Genevieve, you can jump on if you want, or just turn your camera on if you have a camera. If not, I will read this out. Earlier, you were talking about how the Green Party was the first party to recognize and emphasize the climate emergency, and that they've been doing so for 20 years. However, a common theme in the issue of climate justice is that Indigenous people and land defenders should be recognized as the first group who advocated for addressing climate change and protecting the environment. How do you plan to listen to and represent the voices of First Nations people during your campaign and in office, since they have the best knowledge on how to restore the environment and prevent climate change? And no, I don't have any camera, she says, sorry. Yeah, that's a really good point, in the sense that I don't know if I would argue that Indigenous people were the first to address climate change in terms of a scientific argument. I think that your point, if I'm inferring it properly though, is that Indigenous people have been living in a way in which their carbon footprint and their way of living has been far more in sync with the natural cycle in the biosphere than the dominant culture. And in that respect, they have a different cosmology, a different way of seeing how they live as a part of an interconnected whole versus the traditional Western colonialist attitude that we're controlling and farming the environment or using the environment. To them, they're a part of what I understand from having worked with so many different First Nations over time in Peru and in Canada and in different places, is that it's a fairly common theme in the cosmology of Indigenous people that they are an interconnected part of. And therefore, therefore how we treat the environment is so different in their cosmology. And I think if I don't know if you can just let me know, is that what you mean by they were the first ones? Just punch in if you can, and I'll see what you're thinking. Because what I don't want to, I don't think it, like, I don't know the history of exactly who comes up with climate change first, but I know it goes right back to late 1800s. Somebody hypothesizes that the nature of the atmosphere is such that if we put too much carbon into it, it would change. You know, this is the whole, so it's actually quite an old idea, and it gets way more resonance and uptake in the 80s, in the 1980s. And by the 1990s, we see that the science of it is starting to take hold, and there's all the deniers and people saying this isn't going to happen. But throughout the 1990s, the evidence builds and the evidence builds. And of course, we then have all of the Council of the Party meetings, the COP meetings, that sort of established through the UNFCCC, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, that this is actually a reality from a science-based perspective. I think what I'm understanding you, though, is that you're not thinking about science. You're thinking more about the way in which Indigenous people have interacted. I see here you've written OFC, the concept. What does OFC mean? Anybody know? Of course. Of course. Of course, the concept of climate change has long existed, but I mean specifically anthropocentric climate change caused by industry. Well, you know, I'm gonna say, Genevieve, that actually anthropocentric climate change, we've identified it as being pre-industrial in the sense that I mean, it really takes off. What basically parts per million stayed at a pretty stable 280 parts per million for a long, long time. And then you get into the late 1800s and you have this massive agriculture that suddenly the tractors and everybody starts really changing the land base a lot. And you see an explosion in deforestation at the same time that you suddenly see the uptake of the burning of coal. And you see then also the burning of fossil fuels that instantly starts coming in around the early 1910s, 1920, 1930s, oil takes off. And it was that burning of coal and that burning of oil, fossilized fuels, and emitting those into the carbon where we see 280 parts per million suddenly start to rise dramatically. So it's been really, really steady state for a long time. And then all of a sudden it started to go up. And then you see now, I don't know when everybody on the call started following this, but basically if you go back far enough, you'll see that the stable state that we needed was 350 parts per million. That was the maximum we could go to. And that's why 350.org, the climate change group, is called 350.org. It's because 350 was where we needed to be. Okay, so we went from 280, the maximum we could go to was 350. And we climbed and climbed and climbed. And I remember when we were at 370, it was so alarming. 380, 390. I think I read, somebody can Google it, but I believe we're at 418 parts per million right now, and quickly climbing to the terrifying 4 times carbon scenario that we are predicted to be at in 2050. So these are just technicalities, because I want to come back to your key point here, Genevieve, which is how do we relate with Indigenous peoples? And I think with Indigenous peoples, particularly in our riding, and I'm going to localize it here, is that they have come up with some very specific ways in which we can take action in our riding. And let me give you an example. The Squamish people have said, and I'm on Squamish territory, and they have said unequivocally that they want a moratorium on all old growth logging in our riding. And that's something that as a federal MP, I would fully 100% support. Why? Because we are now at the point where we need those living trees as carbon sinks are far more valuable standing and living than they are if we knock them down and turn them into pulp and paper. And this is really critical. So we've got Indigenous peoples taking the lead on this, right? And saying we want to do that. And I agree. I think we have to see that there's tons of leadership. I also do want to say, however, that not all Indigenous people, when we use Indigenous people, we lump them all into one category. I'm a little bit cautious of that, because I think if you look, you will see that Indigenous peoples vary in their opinions on some of these critical subjects substantially. There are some that are 100% behind pipelines, and we have to be careful, right? So again, there's a lot of politics involved in this, but I will say, totally willing to say this on record too, is that as a generalized cosmology, the Indigenous way of seeing yourself, seeing self and group in relation to the environment is fundamentally different than how Western society has evolved. And we have so much to learn from that ethic, that way of seeing the world. And in terms of climate change, it even brings up the idea, like if you're part of the environment and you're an interconnected part of it, you really can't control that environment. That environment controls you. You see that there's a big difference there in how you're viewing the role of people. One is we steward the land, we take care of it, we manage forests, or we manage the land, or we're going to manage. The other one that's classic is we're going to manage and control the atmosphere through carbon capture and so on. We think we can control the atmosphere of the world. To me, it's a way, it's a very, it's not very humble given what we're actually as a species. I mean, as a species, we're probably just going to wipe ourselves out, right? And we'll learn the humility test a lot faster. But the point here is that if we were a little more humble, we'd realize actually, no, we're here by the grace of the atmosphere, and we're here by the grace of the rest of the environmental system. And our goal is to survive. And we have to learn to live in an integrated way. And I agree 100% that cosmology that Indigenous people have had, and I've witnessed it in Peru, I've witnessed it here all over British Columbia, is absolutely fundamental to a climate emergency in particular. I hope I answered your question. Just give me a tick if I answered your question, or if you want, you can always come on too. Anybody else here? We're at an hour. We were going to try and kind of wrap it up at an hour, but if there's anybody else who wants to join, or if you have any other questions, I'm willing to answer any question you like. That was the deal when I do these and when we go live, was to try and be as transparent as possible about what we're trying to evolve here in our riding as a group of people. I can't see now. Ken, can you help me here? I can't quite see the full screen. Am I good, or am I good to go? Or I think I'm good to go. So I think I'm going to leave it at that for emergency. Maybe some final words here, which is that I did do something unusual tonight, and that is that I tried to stay away from the technical nature of an emergency, because I think that's missing the point. The whole point when the government stands up and when the United Nations stands up and says, would you declare emergencies? Or when people ask you to declare emergencies in municipalities, it's not so much the technical things they want, it's a shift. It's a shift in how we're viewing the situation that we're in. And on that one, I will say, I actually personally, I think we're in deep in an emergency. And one of the reasons I think that is because if you know my history, I've traveled around a lot. And I think that in our riding and in Canada in general, we live in a pretty protected bubble for what climate change actually means. If you go to other parts of the world where there are much tougher conditions in terms of people's ability to survive on the land or to survive if the weather changes. Nigeria, where I work, for example, if the weather changes and there's massive dumps and rains and floods, there's such crowded conditions in some places that when those changes happen, it actually means lots of people die. Same thing in Bangladesh. If we get Bangladesh, if there's a flood, that entire floodplain, all those coastal cities, lots of people die. Here, we have these fires happen and we've got sophisticated enough systems that we can evacuate people out, and we have helicopters and we have a lot more resources on our hands to survive a climate emergency. And so we may not feel it the same way. And that's where I think it's also really important as we as Greens keep emphasizing that it's not just about us surviving the climate emergency. It's about being aware that on our planet, our dear planet, there are so many other places that are not surviving already. And we're only halfway through our climate emergency. I see from John, one of the things that makes the emergency greater is that too few people are treating it. Do you want to come on and just say that? I'll just unspot you. We got a couple more minutes. I don't have to rush tonight. Let me just, how do I get you? Oh, I think you got to turn your camera on maybe. Then I can unspotlight you.
Yeah.
There you are.
Yeah, I said it in the chat. One of the things that makes the emergency greater is that too few people are treating it as an emergency. So if you're not treating it as an emergency and it is an emergency, then the emergency just keeps getting bigger.
Yeah. Now let's just throw the lens on ourselves, because let's ask ourselves, do you think in the Green Party, I mean, you're a Green Party person, do you think that we are adequately feeling this as an emergency? I mean, we can look at everybody else, but it's so good sometimes to look at ourselves first, right? And just, do you think we're doing a good job of seeing this as an emergency?
I think most of us are. I had put in earlier in the chat, I had put in that the big question is how much each of us is really willing to give up in terms of our normal way of doing things to reduce our carbon footprint. And if we're strapped for money, okay, what are we willing, are we willing to spend some money on a solar roof? Are we willing solar panels instead of a trip to Europe?
Yeah.
What do we prioritize, and how do we prioritize in our own lives? And it's a key question.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and I would say, when I answer that, when I think about the Green Party, I actually think that we are seeing it as an emergency, because when you look at our policies and when you look at how we've placed it and how we've underlined that it is a climate emergency, and then the fact that we're treating it with such seriousness with our targets, like we're not saying 40 to 45%, that'll work and we'll do this slow. We're actually asking for such a dramatic change. And that to politically sell that takes a lot of guts. But let's look at it this way. It takes a lot of guts in an emergency to stand up and go, people, this plane is burning, right? It takes guts for that pilot to bang on the door and actually tell people, because it's a lot easier just to pretend nothing's happening. Maureen, I see you've got your hand up. I'll just quickly whip over you and see if I can unpin, replace spotlight. I've added you. How are you doing?
Well, I was listening to CBC this morning, and they were interviewing a regional district director from the area around Monty Lake, which was evacuated and which got at about 8 o'clock this morning. He wasn't sure exactly how much of the community had been burned to the ground, but he choked up and ended up in tears. And his words were so symbolic of how we need to react to climate change as an emergency, because he said the problem is that the government, the fire services, whatever, are not jumping on the small fires quickly enough. Yeah. That they're spending too long triaging, assessing, waiting to see. And I just thought, man, that is just that statement just represents so much. And it's so ironic that his community is burning to the ground as part of climate change. And I too wonder, I know that there are a lot of people on the Sunshine Coast who are experiencing serious angst right now about wildfire hitting the Sunshine Coast.
Yeah.
Especially elderly people, just worried they're going to be baked alive in they're going to be charred ruins in their own homes, not being able to get, I mean, literally not being able to get down to the ocean.
Yeah. Yeah. And we have an evacuation issue, right? Because if we had to evacuate quickly, we're pinned on both sides.
Yeah.
So there's a serious issue there. If the fire were to break out in Half Moon Bay or someplace like that, where would it go and what would happen with winds? So we've also have massive forest in terms of a fuel sitting there ready to go.
So it's a struggle not to not feel hopeless. But I think bless Dr. Courtney Howard, who ran to be Green Party leader last year, who keeps saying, and I keep repeating it in my own mind, that the antidote to anxiety is action. And so that's what spurs me on to keep slogging along and trying to get you elected.
Yeah. And the other one is we could use some wins, right? Because when you're fighting fires constantly and you see this forest fire coming, it's helpful to have some wins and to feel like there is some chance here, right? We have climate change, is so much mounting evidence, but it's not over till it's over. It's kind of the way I look at it. And when we do have these wins that can cheer us on, and I think actually getting a Green Party person in this riding would be a really good win. And one thing I could say also to people is that I think others are agreeing, because even last night we raised a lot of money quickly, and that's a win, right? And I think what we can do is in some ways as Green Party people, and I'm not even going to say as Green Party, I think there's other people that could be watching this that are feeling the same sense, that we do need, whatever your party politics. This is something actually that the Green Party has taken leadership on, is they said, whatever your party politics, we're kind of in this one together. This is an emergency, and therefore they've called for a cross-partisan strategy where all the parties would come together to tackle this as if it was an emergency, not one party putting it forward and everybody banging their heads in Parliament and trying to disagree. But if we could think more holistically as government, and if Greens can cross the lines a little bit and show some leadership, and if we can all come together and go sort of how we did with COVID. Like, I mean, the parties cooperated a bit on COVID, right? And that's our goal. I think you probably agree with this anyways, to see we don't have time to actually go through a parliamentary fight in the next 10 years and solve this one. We're actually going to have to cooperate and get us through this sense of hopelessness around climate. There's a lot of young people too that I talk to. I'm sure you've talked to them, that are looking at the climate angst as a big issue in this generation. Anyway, we will not end on that note. That is one thing I hate to do, is end on climate angst and emergency. I think what we do is we end on realizing that we're not actually a small group anymore. I think we are sometimes politically active fighting this, but if you look at who actually is aware of climate, who is concerned about climate, that when we've been going door to door as campaigners, it's every second door is people are saying, yeah, this is a big deal. And it's not hard when it's smoky. Like we went through West Van the other day and there's smoke everywhere. And people are going, this is big. They can feel the plane. Yeah. So that's the good news, is that we're not fighting uphill on that anymore. We don't have to say to people, oh, by the way, there's this thing called climate change. Those days are over. Maureen, you're an inspiration on this. I just want to say, everybody knows you, but if you're on Facebook or watching, I mean, Maureen, you've been going and tackling and been a Green Party and stalwart, and you don't let this get you down. Can I ask you, how do you do that? Because I feel that's a skill, to not let yourself get disillusioned or any of that. You just keep going. How are you doing it? Because you're so consistent. Last night I watched you, the whole thing fundraiser, and you just kept going and going and going, and you don't slow down. And I'm curious, how are you doing it? Where are you sourcing this energy from?
I had a nap today.
No, but I'm talking more about this energy to keep going with the Green Party and just keep going with and fighting climate change. And you just have a terrific amount of energy for this.
I feel as if I have found my clan in the Green Party. I mean, just so many terrific people who have more energy than I do, and yeah, it just keeps rolling along, and having an excellent candidate like you, and a good team behind you. Yeah, how could we not?
Well, that's an invitation. I think that's an invitation to anybody who's watching, that if you're not part of this clan, or you haven't jumped in and you're at green active, then think about it. Come and join us. Like, we're actually are a bunch of really good people trying to change the world and make it better, and we're trying to do it through politics. And by golly, I think we will. Like, I think that's how change happens, right? Is we just attack to try and get these problems that we're facing solved. So good for you for being so consistent. I take inspiration from you, by the way. Take inspiration.
Mike, you are at the Buccaneer tomorrow at 1.
Yeah.
Meeting with volunteers.
Meeting with volunteers, yeah.
And then those who are so inspired will stay on a little bit later and learn how to do canvassing.
Yeah, and we're going to get out there and actually try it. One of the easiest ways to do this stuff is just to come get trained. Ken's going to help us, and we're going to have some people that know are good at going door to door. And then we're just going to make that little leap, which is just go to the first door. Like, once you've done that first door, it's like it's easy after that. And so if tomorrow you're feeling brave, or if tonight you've watched this and you're feeling like, I just want to take one of those steps, it's a huge step to go canvassing. If you don't want to do that, fine. But come and join and meet us. And we're at the Buccaneer at 1 o'clock, I believe it is.
Yeah. And then on Sunday, 1 o'clock at Dougal Park. At
Dougal Park at 1 o'clock. And the world starts small with a small group of people. So please come out. And for those of you who don't even live in our riding or have joined us just tonight because you're interested in what we're up to, thanks for joining, and spread the word, because we are trying to change the world in our own way. And I believe that we will. That is something that you don't know how these stories go, right? You don't know whether the plane lands or not. John's plane, he didn't know whether it's going to land or not. We don't know. And it could land. We might land this one. I'm hoping that we do, and have some fun along the way. All right. I think that's it for our evening. It's been great. It's Friday evening. Good for all of you for spending a Friday evening talking about climate emergency. And I hope that it starts to rain and we get a little break from Mother Nature in our riding here. We need it. Thanks for coming out, everybody. Thank you very much. All right.
Thank you.
Thanks for watching on Facebook. Thanks for watching on Facebook. You know how to get a hold of us. All right. Bye-bye.
Thanks.